Welcome back. Here we go again. For those of you that are listening to this seeing it on streaming, we thank you for joining us. We're a little bit behind our schedule, but not badly, so we'll carry on. This is the session where we will be telling you about some of our research results from the small-scale irrigation laboratory. And let me have the next slide, please. Next slide. So basically, we'll be talking about the. I'll give a brief overview of what the project, what the agreement is about. We'll have a briefing on field studies, household surveys, and this will all occur before lunch. Then integrated analysis and upscaling, and then stakeholder engagement and capacity development will be in the session after lunch. So that's the approach that we'll be using in the central part of the day. Next, please. So I'll briefly review the elements of the agreement and the overview. Our objective is to increase food production, improve nutrition, protect the environment, and accelerate economic development through the improved access to small-scale irrigation technologies. Next. This is the briefing that we're in now. We'll talk about this next. I think we're going backwards somehow or other. That's I can't talk backwards very well, but okay. Now, thank you. So these are the major elements of the agreement. We're operating in 3 countries: Ethiopia, Tanzania, Ghana. We're targeting smallholder farmers in the USAID zones of influence. We're involved in studies in farmers' fields, household surveys, analysis and capacity, as I've said. We will be looking at the consequences of the interventions in terms of their impact on production, environmental consequences, and economic consequences, and nutritional consequences. And the scaling that we'll talk about goes from farm level to national level. Our stakeholders include practitioners, including farmers and others at local levels, national decision makers, private sector investors in infrastructure, and then future development donors. And in terms of capacity development, I'll tell you about both individual capacity development of students and scientists, as well as institutional capacity development in government and universities. Next, please. Basically, I'll call it the ILSSI project, Innovative Center for Small-Scale Irrigation. It's basically an integrated package where the pieces really fit together to make a whole. An assessment done early in the game to decide where to make investments in field studies and household surveys, a set of field studies and household surveys that feed into an analysis and projection of impact component, and all of these come together to talk about an overall product in small-scale irrigation. From the analysis and projection standpoint, we will tell you later this afternoon about our integrated decision support system, where we have 3 models: an environmental model, a production model, and an economic model that work together to create a holistic a view of the consequences of various kinds of research or policy interventions, and that will allow us to look at the best trade-offs in solutions for a total farming systems approach. Next, please. I want to just thank all of our partners that are all represented here today that have been involved with the project since the inception. Obviously, from USAID, our sponsor, at Texas A&M, our overall organization is Texas A&M AgriLife Research, of which the Borlaug Research Institute is a component part. And then we have 3 international CGIAR centers, the International Livestock Research Institute, the International Water Management Institute, and the International Food Policy Research Institute. And then we have the North Carolina A&T University as the other U.S.-based university component. We have active university partners in all 3 of the countries that we're working in, and a number of private sector partners that are already identified and working with us. and we're working closely with a number of agencies of government in all three countries that are taking the products of our research and giving them consideration for further development. Next, please. We have, some mention has already been made of this morning, but we have a number of collaborators that have been very important to us for the information and knowledge that we've gained from them, and also for sharing the cost of some of the developments that we've had. Africa Rising has been a very active on-site, on-farm collaboration, as well as collaboration and analysis. This program called Lives, done by ILRI, has provided a very important source of information on economics and social activities for Ethiopian smallholders. One of the other innovation laboratories, the Sustainable Intensification Innovation Laboratory, we have a project going jointly with them that we call Sustainable Intensified Production Systems, their influence on nutrition. And that's extending our current project more into the nutrition area, and it includes an involvement with another one of the innovation labs, the Nutrition Innovation Lab at Tufts University Medical School. The Horticultural Innovation Laboratory has a pilot study going, and as you'll see this morning, quite a few of the crops that have been studied in our field studies are horticultural crops. And then as a backdrop, we've gotten considerable support over the entire life of the project from the engagement across the CGIAR centers that deal with this CGIAR program on water, land, and ecosystems. Next, please. So the status of our project today is that we're in the 5th year of a 5-year cooperative agreement. Our field research and household surveys are near completion, so we'll be able to show you relatively mature data today. The analysis and reporting is scheduled to be completed in July. Our final report is due in 2018. We have recently completed, USAID has completed an external review which was favorable. And then the renewal decision for continuation in phase 2 is pending as this project as this symposium is ongoing. Next, please. So what I thought maybe would be a good way to give you a very brief and very broad overview is to give you an impression that my team and I have for how we are contributing to the overall global food security strategy. Dr. Bertram showed you that strategy in some detail this morning, and we're going to just not give you proof of what I'm going to say, but ask you to look for proof as you listen to our briefings to see whether what I'm telling you really does make sense. But these are some of the accomplishments that we and outcomes that we think address the objective number 1, which is inclusive and sustainable agriculture-led economic growth. And we hope that you'll agree that the research evidence is there that one can have a solid increase in income through small-scale irrigation, have a consistent and reliable year-round product at the marketplace, develop an infrastructure that supports small-scale irrigation, that's like finance and equipment and so on, a more effective use of labor, particularly women's time, using farming systems to seek the best combination of production, environmental, and economic consequences of various interventions, to develop principles that can be used for improved water management and conservation at multiple levels, and then the capacity to plan and evaluate new small-scale irrigation methods at the national level, the ability to scale up from the farm level and regional studies that we've done to the national level, and to use that scale up for planning and further evaluation of new projects. Next, please. The second objective, strengthen resilience among people and ecosystems. We hope that you'll agree that when you've heard our story that we have demonstrated that small-scale irrigation increases the production of food in the dry season, which gives you year-round food for consumption. That it has the capacity for offsetting weather extremes to avoid the shocks that Dr. Bertram talked about through the use of small-scale irrigation. Commercialized irrigated kitchen gardens for women farmers to help provide sustainable food over the year. Farmers planning production systems for the use of small-scale irrigation, where they will be looking at systems that give you the best production, environmental and economic consequences. Capacity building to enhance the knowledge and improve planning methods to help sustain resilience. And then the capacity for evidence-based planning and evaluation at the national level, using that for national level planning to help strengthen resilience. Next, please. Objective 3 is a well-nourished population, especially among women and children. And I mentioned again the collaboration that we have with the Sustainable Intensification Laboratory and the Tufts Human Nutrition Laboratory that have given us a better handle on evidence for showing how small-scale irrigation can increase the quantity and quality of food for women and children, increased income for the purchase of food. This is very important, increased diversity of foods produced, year-round access to fresh foods, and then this collaboration has helped, as I said, helped us focus on nutrition. So, next please. So those are the ways that we see our project contributing to the major goals of the global food security strategy by way of introduction, and my colleagues will now give you much more of a specific indication of how that works. So our next presenter will be dealing with results from field interventions. Dr. Nicole Lafore is a senior scientist with the International Water Management Institute. She's based in Pretoria, but works in all of the countries that we work, and has really been a very strategic thinker with us in the planning and execution of this project. We're looking forward to your comments. Careful.
I almost need a ladder there. Okay, let me see if I can figure out how all of these pieces work. So one of the things about this project was we actually worked with farmers in farmer fields, trying out different technologies, tools, practices, from everything from water lifting to conservation agriculture to microfinance. And so we took something of a action research approach and learning side by side with farmers and extension and other stakeholders at local level. And the field interventions, it's important to mention that it is International Water Management Institute, but it's also the Livestock Research Institute and North Carolina A&T. So all of us had roles to play in doing this. So I'll just give you an overview of what the field interventions were or are, some of the messages that are coming out, and some of the pathways and ideas that we're looking at for scaling up that's emerging from this research. But I wanted to start by just mentioning that this is considered a very collaborative process. And we have multiple layers of consultation. We have a continuous consultation process from national level and regional level, actually, to subnational, district, and at the very local level with farmers. So the actual selection of what the interventions would be was based on a consultation at those multiple levels, so that we ensured that what we were doing in the fields was actually relevant and fit with national priorities. And was actually speaking to the actual concerns of farmers and extension and other actors in the field. So we've continued this consultation process across the 5 years of the project, and right going into sharing results. So these are the countries that we're working in: Ghana, Tanzania, and Ethiopia. And in each of these countries, we work with national partners, so that includes national universities. So in Ethiopia, it's been Bahir Dar University and Arba Minch. In Tanzania, it's primarily been Sokoine University, and in Ghana, it's University for Development Studies. Now, at times, we do collaborate with other universities and other projects, as Dr. Clark was showing, but those have been our national partners largely for implementation. And also, the selection of sites was based on criteria that emerged from the Ag Water Solutions project, which was a predecessor to this project. But we also did this within the zones of influence for Feed the Future in each country. The field sites were important because this is where we were collecting data that was going into the higher level analysis through the IDSS suite of models. And so we have, through this project, developed some unique data sets related to small-scale irrigation, nutrition, gender, and the water resources, obviously, and soils. And again, this is in farmers' fields. We consulted with farmers. We wanted to make sure that it was in the actual areas where they work. They provided the fields where we would be doing this side by side. So this is not demonstration plots. These were not necessarily controlled plots, but we were learning together as we were going through. So I'll just show for these, for those who are interested specifically in the areas where we were working, these are the sites in Ethiopia, Ghana, in Upper East and Northern region, and that is not the Ghana sites, that is, for some reason, Tanzania. So we've got those swapped as many times as we looked at this presentation, and we missed that. Okay, so some of the, I'm going to really focus more on the bigger picture messages that are emerging. And it's interesting to me to listen to the presentations this morning, and we can really see some consensus coming from these different, across the different institutions from the last 2 days and from some of the partners who were participating over the last couple of days. So, it's nice to see that, we are reaching some, some of our messages are starting to merge and be reinforcing. So one of the things that we did was we started with, okay, so these are some of the larger messages that are coming out. We've done cost-benefit analysis, so we know that, this is economically feasible. That's very important, because if it's not economically feasible, it's a non-starter. So that, contributes to the economic sustainability. That small-scale irrigation has multiple benefits, so it's not just about incomes. It goes beyond that. And a really important thing that's emerged from, the studies with the farmers is this issue of, it needs to be labor-saving, and that was mentioned this morning, and that's something that has come out again and again and again through the consultations we've had, but also through the cost-benefit analysis. And one of the things that we did was we wanted to go beyond water lifting. So we said, okay, there's been research around pumps, and there's a lot of projects that give out pumps, and there's different types of pumps that have been given out. But we really wanted to understand, and start to dig a little bit deeper beyond water lifting. So we looked more at on-farm water management strategies and practices that could enhance the water lifting that was already taking place as part of that farmer-led irrigation. But we also, being aware of the need for scaling at some point, we wanted to look at high potential value chains and microfinance as opportunities and entry points for scaling. And then, of course, understanding the risks at landscape level and what the opportunities would be for mitigating. So these are the really broad stroke messages that are coming out. So I'll spend a little bit of time going in a little bit more specifically. So across all the countries, we've looked at the economic feasibility at farm level. And one of the things that we wanted to understand was, at what point is this going to be profitable? At what point do farmers get the return that they need? And obviously that depends on the crop they're growing. It depends on the technology, both the water lifting and the conveyance technology. But across the board, almost every single thing that we looked at was definitely profitable, especially for high-value, low-labor crops. So one of the things that was important to us was that we valued household labor in this project. There's been a lot of projects in the past that don't value household labor because they say, well, it's free. But the farmers themselves say it's not free. You know, this is an opportunity cost. We have other things that we could do, whether it's migrating, whether it's something else on farm, whether it's engaging in food processing, in some cases even collecting shea butter or whatever it might be in the landscape. So it was important for us to make sure that we costed household labor. And what we actually found was that labor is the largest cost of small-scale irrigation. So while we tend to think about how are we going to fund technologies, a lot of the farmers are actually thinking about the cost to them for labor. And we also wanted to understand the repayment period. So if we do invest in, technologies, what is the repayment period for this? And depending on if they were part of a group, depending on the type of technology, we found anywhere between 6 months to 2 years for repaying credit for the technologies. And in some cases with group pumps, they might pay the group might pay off in 6 months, but then the individuals would go on to try to purchase their own pump, so then it might take them another year to purchase that pump at an individual level. But the most important thing was to say that, yes, this is profitable and it's economically feasible. And one of the other important things that we found was related to the high-value crops, and it wasn't just the traditionally irrigated crops, which tends to be onion and tomato, but it was also leafy greens that are local. So cocorus and amaranthus, which we tend not to think about, because we don't necessarily see that, those actually in some cases were far more profitable than onion and also highly nutritious. So we're seeing multiple benefits there. So speaking of multiple benefits, we do think largely about the income because farmers wouldn't be investing in this themselves without seeing that income benefit. But when we did surveys, when we did in-depth interviews, we also found that actually the benefits are many, and it depends on what the farmer wants, and it depends in some cases on what the project wants, what those benefits might be. So labor saving was critical. Income and multiple crops per year was critical. But so was quality. So in some cases, farmers were saying, well, it's not just about increasing the yield, it's the fact that the quality of the produce increased. And because the produce quality increased, we got a better price for it. So it positioned them better in the market. In some cases, water productivity increased. But also critical, as mentioned this morning, is that multiple purpose. So, for example, though motor pumps might be more profitable, in this particular study, we found that they were higher labor because you were carrying them back and forth to field, and they weren't able to use them for the household purposes. So they preferred solar pumps and in some cases even rope and washer because of the fact that it was lower labor, but they had the multiple purposes. So it reduced labor for women in particular. Although I have to say that one of the things that we found in our study was that both men and women within a household recognize the amount of time and effort that's put into water collection. So it is a priority across the board for families to reduce that labor for multiple purposes. So I think for us, one of the messages that also came out of this is, in terms of programming and planning, if you understand what some of the benefits are and what your project or what a program might be aiming for, you could actually begin to target specific technologies and practices that would help you achieve those particular aims. So as mentioned, labor is generally the major cost. It's pretty much almost always above the capital investment in the technology. Of course, differing by crop and the technology itself. And sometimes that labor may involve carrying the pump to and from the field, whereas other technologies that are installed near the household, they don't have those kinds of issues. But the labor-saving technologies were more profitable, but also more preferred by farmers. So I don't know how to use this particular, maybe it's a different thing, but nope, don't know how to do it. But anyway, what you can see is within that red circle, that's solar pumps. So you'll see the number of irrigation labor days to the left, irrigation depth applied at the bottom, and what you're seeing is irrigation labor required is lower, but irrigation depth is fairly high. And we've looked at this in terms of profitability. It overlaps really nicely, so we actually see more profitability in some cases for the solar pumps because you're saving labor, but you're actually getting the same irrigation depth that you would with some of the other technologies. One of the other important things about labor saving is this relates to the research that's been done on credit. So I'm bringing in the economic study here, whereas what is shown here is more biophysical. But the ability or the availability of household labor affects a household's willingness to borrow for a technology. But in particular, that if there's women of a sort of labor and productive age, the more women there are in the household of that age, the less likely the household is to borrow. So if a male-headed household sees that there's enough women in the household that can do the labor, they will not borrow for the technologies. So these are some of the really important things that are coming out from the research that we're doing on microcredit that relate back to labor and how that labor can influence adoption and willingness to pay and willingness to borrow. So as I mentioned, one of the things that we wanted to do is to go beyond water lifting, because we do know that farmers are adopting pumps. They've been doing this for some time. They're adopting different types of pumps. But what about once you're on farm? What happens at that level, and how can we actually enhance the use of that pump? How can we make that more productive and more beneficial at farm level, as well as at landscape level, I should say. So one of the things that we did was we looked at a range of irrigation scheduling tools. What we notice is that in some water scarce areas, they may be under irrigating, but in areas where they have sufficient water, they tend to over irrigate. So we worked with farmers that were both new to irrigation and farmers who had irrigated for about 10 years to understand some of the differences in terms of water application at the field level. What we find is that with irrigation scheduling tools and with irrigation scheduling practices, it increases yields, it increases profit, it improves the water productivity and water use, and it improves fertilizer use, because if you're not overwatering, your fertilizer use can be more efficient. But with the farmers, the main driver for them was that it reduced labor and costs. So if you're pumping and you know that you can stop pumping, it's going to save fuel and labor. So for the farmers themselves, it was about reducing labor and costs, but from a water productivity point of view and from a water resource management point of view, we're considering it from that side and the benefits from that side, whereas the farmers' incentives tend to be more economic and labor related. And so what you see that link between the yields, obviously, and the profit, and then the amount of water use in the field. So another aspect of the on-field water management was conservation agriculture and introducing that into homestead gardening to move the homestead gardens towards the commercial. And generally, we found with the commercial moving towards commercial gardens with some of the basic conservation agricultural practices, there is saving potential there for water, soil, and in some cases labor, depending on how conservation agriculture is being applied. That it does improve quantity and quality of what's being produced. But there's also some serious constraints to scaling this. There's limited mulch available in most of the areas where we were looking at. We had issues with pest control. And also the extension services are not necessarily familiar with conservation agriculture methods. Although that said, most of them are not trained in irrigation either. So that is kind of a statement across the board. Okay, so that's some of the results related directly to the field interventions. But, it's important for us to think in terms of, how do we scale these technologies? Well, we know that farmers are already adopting these, but, what can we do to enhance that adoption? What can we do to take advantage of the opportunities? So we focused on a couple of areas to understand that better. And one of those relates to the value chains that have high potential for irrigation. So as has already been mentioned this morning, one of those is fodder. And these fodder markets are developing in the urban areas. But in addition to that, when you actually look at the numbers, we're finding that the demand for seed for fodder is increasing. And the sources at the farm level are decreasing as they're putting, fields into other things, or they're losing land and that's being split up. Those plots and things are being split up. So what's happening now is, as these markets are emerging, farmers are actually starting to allocate more land and more water exclusively for forage production. Now, one of the things that we've been looking at with this project is looking specifically at, okay, so which forages, are preferred where, what livestock, benefits the most from these. But doing the cost-benefit analysis, we found that both in terms of a cash crop, so selling the fodder itself at these emerging markets, or using that fodder for on-farm use to increase the livestock productivity. In both cases, there's high potential for productivity here. So these are markets that are already emerging. What we're just looking at is, how do we enhance that? What is needed? Maybe that means irrigated seed production for forage as well as irrigating the forage itself. But understanding where are these value chains that are going to enable that scaling of the supply. It's about increasing the market for irrigated value chains so that you can also support the extension of those supply chains for irrigated technologies. And then, as I already mentioned, we also were, somewhat surprised by some of the value chains that were coming out in terms of local crops. These are neglected crops like the amaranthus and cocorus and things like that, which are high value, but we tend not to focus on when we do this type of research. So, as has been mentioned many times over the last couple of days, there's this issue of microfinance and financing the purchase of these technologies, that capital investment. So that's a clear message that's coming out from farmers is, what about finance? How do we purchase these technologies? And in Ethiopia itself, we actually worked with cooperatives in every single area. We did multiple trainings with the cooperatives and also training with farmers on how to manage microfinance from, a borrower point of view. One of the things that came out of previous research was that most of the farmers that this farmer-led irrigation is almost entirely in the top quintile of farmers. So it's almost always youth and wealthier farmers to begin with that are doing this. So the issue for me and for this project about scaling up has really been about equality. So how do we, what are those entry points for enabling people in lower quintiles to also invest in these technologies? And for us, that's been an important question about looking at these scaling up opportunities. So finance becomes one of those. So we did find that, yes, it's, access to microfinance will increase adoption. And as already been mentioned, the feasibility to repay is there. The financiers themselves, the microfinance and rural banks, are looking at irrigated production as lower risk, so they see this as a potential opportunity for them to expand their products. We looked at pump sharing groups and what the dynamics were there, where it was most effective, and really finding that the smaller the group, the better. The larger the group, the more problems they had with collective action. However, credit is often not available. Most of these farmers are in locations where it's just not there. There's a high cost of credit. In Ghana, there's places where it's 45% interest in a year. And even in other countries, you might find 12 to 15%, and that's considered low interest. And also just a lot of farmers felt threatened by the terms and conditions, that these can be quite, harsh methods for recollecting when they borrow. So there's definitely some constraints around it. A lot of people think microfinance is going to be an instant solution, and what's coming out of the field, it's clear that it's not, just add water, and, it's not going to be an instant solution. Also the capacity element. As I mentioned, we worked with cooperatives for microfinance in Ethiopia, where there is actually more opportunity. But we found in some of the cooperatives there was only 50% literacy rate of the cooperative employees. So they're lending, but they actually don't have literacy and numeracy skills. So the cooperatives themselves is quite, the institutional capacity there is very low. And same with the small-scale irrigation. So across the project, we spent every single season, we did multiple trainings with the same farmers, with extra farmers, bringing in extension to train. And also with the people who have to fix pumps, set up pipes, set up water storage and all of that. So it's important to mention that one of the aspects of scaling we cannot lose sight of is that capacity element. Okay, so just a couple of concluding remarks. I've probably already gone over my time, but a couple of concluding remarks relates to the sustainability. So it's, what is the potential here for small-scale irrigation in terms of sustainable intensification? It's clear, there are benefits and multiple benefits to farmers, and there's a lot of incentives for them to adopt this. But we need to look beyond water lifting and look at enhancing water management at the field level to get more benefit and to mitigate some of those risks that come at landscape level. The experience and training improves on-farm water management. We saw, definitely over 1, 2, and 3 years, you would see a progression towards better on-farm water management. And then, as mentioned, matching the technology packages to the aims. What are the goals of your project? What are your goals of your program? And then you can actually start to look at how those benefits overlap with those goals. Reducing labor, which has already been mentioned this morning. Increasing access to finance products, but also information. There is definitely a huge information gap, even in projects that attempt to target more information to farmers. Expanding the role of private sector, which has been a major emphasis of the last 2 days, and again this morning. And then applying tools at multiple levels so that we can understand the trade-off. So farm level, landscape level, watershed level, national level. Looking at those issues related to, water balance, water quality, multiple use related to the water quality, looking at the impact of intensification on the water sources that are being used. So all of those things are also being considered, but you'll hear more about that in the afternoon. And then obviously moving towards looking at these governance and regulatory mechanisms. When you're dealing with individual farms and individual farmers and those individual wells, because we were almost exclusively, this was very shallow groundwater. But how do we move towards mitigating some of those risks and moving towards whether it's collective action or enforcement of regulations? How do we move towards that? So these are some of the considerations we have going forward, and as we're thinking about these emerging messages. So that is the sort of basic messages that are coming out of the field interventions. And I will hand over to Claudia Ringler to talk more about the gender and nutrition.
Yeah, first. This was a lot of information, I think, you just heard, and unfortunately more to come, or fortunately, whichever way. So I'll just very quickly focus on some of the household survey results. So now you've heard a lot about the field interventions, lots of learnings working directly with farmers across sites, across ecologies, across technologies. So this is like one level higher up. So we're looking at irrigators versus non-irrigators, asking really 2 main questions. One is, does irrigation contribute to nutrition? And the other one is, does irrigation contribute to women's empowerment? And I'm actually only focusing on the very first component of that, only the irrigation nutrition question. And Elizabeth Bryan, my colleague from IFPRI, will then take over for the irrigation gender question. There is in the middle, I put in a couple of slides on other constraints that we just identified from the survey for upscaling small-scale irrigation, but we have to do additional analysis on that because we really focused more on the nutrition and gender linkages up to now. So anyway, so let's go ahead. So yeah, before we started any household survey design on irrigation nutrition, we did a systematic review of what's out there on irrigation nutrition linkages, and we identified 5 pathways from irrigation to nutrition, because nutrition is a multidimensional, complex challenge. So it's definitely cannot be addressed by one single intervention. That's why we haven't gone very far on the nutrition situation in the world, because we have been trying a lot of a lot of panacea type interventions. So we identified 4 positive pathways through which water or irrigation can affect nutritional outcomes. So one is the direct food production, and here if we focusing on small scale farmer-led irrigation, the focus or the idea is that these irrigators would focus on a more diversified crop portfolio, so more vegetables, more fruits, obviously, especially in the dry season when these things tend to be in shorter supply, compared to, for example, large-scale irrigation that might just be rice or cotton, sugarcane, whatever. The other one is the income pathway, where, of course, now that we are producing a lot more, hopefully, we will also have a market surplus, and we go to the market, we sell it, and we can buy a lot of healthy things. That, of course, is, these pathways are mutually interdependent, and the question is really who sells the produce and who buys whatever else we do need for nutrition and health. So, but anyway, that's the second pathway. The third one is WASH, and you heard Rob focused quite a bit on that. There had been a lot of evidence a couple years ago on the very strong potential benefit of WASH for nutritional outcomes. I think the evidence is now becoming a bit more mixed. Maybe it's another solution that's not a panacea for sure, but certainly it's an important pathway to look into and to see if it makes a difference. Do I have more water for domestic uses, sanitation, these multiple use concept as well? So, can I get a bigger bang for the buck on the nutrition side through that pathway? The final one is women's empowerment. It's a challenging one. And there, the important entry point seems to be time use, and we have heard a lot about that. Labor saving matters. If we have another pump coming into the household and the women have to do more weeding, or they have to spend more time in the field, takes away from childcare. It might not necessarily be positive, but at the same time, if they don't have to go out and collect water, if they have a labor-saving technology, if they can take more decisions, it increases their decision space in the household, maybe it's a positive thing. The negative pathway that also exists, and we've also spent quite a bit of time on in ILSSI, and it becomes more important under upscaling, is the water pollution and disease pathway. So under the companion project, SIPSIN, we have gone out and done actually malaria measurements. Here we asked people about malaria, but there we actually went out and tested it. So to make sure that we are not reducing nutritional outcomes through our irrigation interventions. And while preliminary, we didn't find any malaria related to small-scale irrigation. So that's an important probably additional benefit from small-scale farmer-led irrigation compared to the larger scale systems. Anyway, so those are the pathways. So now going back to some of the messages that Dr. Clark put out at the beginning. Yes, irrigation increases income. The value of crop production is quite a bit higher. This is just one example from Ethiopia, descriptives. Without irrigation, with irrigation, we see a big difference. Nutrition, descriptives, household food insecurity access scale is one intermediate nutrition indicator. We do see better outcomes for households who are irrigators. And then what do they produce? Yes, as we thought, and also what the systematic review told us, they do produce more vegetables and they do produce more fruit. So that sounds all quite positive. So now a few more details on descriptives. Again, intermediate nutrition indicators. So red means that we're in the right direction. That means we have more positive outcomes for irrigators compared to non-irrigators. This is now all 3 countries. And that is the case for household food insecurity access, again, for all 3 countries. Also for overall household dietary diversity. So the number of food groups consumed is significantly higher for irrigators. The indicator works also well for female dietary diversity, with the exception of Ethiopia, where it actually goes in the other direction, but the difference is not statistically significant. Whoops. Oh, please go. Okay. Whoops, now it goes too well. Okay. We have started to look more into the consumption patterns of irrigators versus non-irrigators, and we've heard already a lot about animal source food this morning, and so we do see a statistically significant difference in these very important protein components for households with irrigation compared to households without irrigation. And also a little note, yes, these animal source foods are obviously more expensive, high income elasticity, and so there is, again, and obviously that has to be procured, they're not growing those seafood, the seafood, etc. So it means there's this income pathway among those pathways that I've shown you seems to be operating here. And then for Ghana, I know our Ghanaian colleagues have always been waiting for our Ghanaian results, and we're starting to show those. We do also show that we have a higher consumption, so that is actually the production diversity pathway to some extent, higher consumption of homegrown fruits and vegetables in Ghana compared to those purchased for irrigators, because obviously they grow more, but obviously they still have income and they actually use it to buy other products. So there is certainly very dynamic implications for nutrition from irrigation. Now some econometric analysis, so trying to look at the income versus the production pathway, and what we found for the locations in Tanzania and Ethiopia, that it's the income pathway that operates. So basically irrigation significantly improves income because they sell, they produce, they use this increased income to buy other foods, increases dietary diversity. So while the production diversity also exists, it's not the one that improves the household dietary diversity outcome. So it's the income pathway that's operating here. Doesn't mean that's everywhere the same. What it means is that these households have had some market access, so they have been able to sell their produce, and that's how they have improved their intermediary nutrition indicators. So what can we do? What can irrigation projects do to do a better job? We have not finalized those recommendations. Those are really just the very first set of ideas, but we will formalize that, and we hope to really reach out to various irrigation investors who are actually interested to also show we are not just increasing yields, we are going beyond that. So one is really at the beginning, before you go and set out and develop yet another irrigation project, make it clear that food security and nutrition are real goals, explicit goals, as well as empowering women, because nutrition and women's empowerment are so closely intertwined. And you'll hear more about that from Elizabeth Bryan shortly. Then, don't just go out there, send your irrigation engineers and put that system in place, or, sell your pumps. Don't just do that. Integrate and link. Often these programs exist. Link existing programs on health and nutrition with these irrigation development plans. Bring these people in. In SIPSIN, again, the companion project, we have Bahir Dar University doing a nutrition training intervention, at least for some of the households. So just to see, can we push the nutrition benefits, the outcome, can we push it a little bit further? Then, as we've also heard from Rob this morning, recognize the multiple uses of irrigation. And there again, recognize doesn't just mean, by the way, you can do more things. There's a lot of prevention, a lot of capacity building. There are a lot of devices that have to be built so the wells are not just open and the animals can drink directly out of the wells and actually pollute the irrigation or domestic water source, the joint water source. So you have to do it a little bit differently if you actually want to ensure that nutrition and women's empowerment are improved while advocating for those multiple uses. Yeah, encourage kitchen garden. I liked when Ruth yesterday said kitchen gardens is not very glamorous. Cash crop garden or something they'll have to call it. But we really should encourage those because of this multiple benefits that have already been mentioned. And really go back, make sure you get the Ministry of Health, the SUN, the nutrition movements in the countries, and the agriculture ministers together, the irrigation ministries, and to say, yeah, we actually all want the same thing, but to actually get to it, we have to do things slightly differently. So I think that's the message. Oh, the message I want to leave you with for nutrition, but as I promised, a little bit on some of the other constraints. And there, whenever it's interesting. So EMI and IFPRI, so we work on the same thing, and EMI said it's for us was so interesting to see the very high labor cost. Labor cost was the largest cost. I'm an economist. I'm like, yes, not surprised. I was surprised about the pest and disease challenges that these irrigators face in the dry season. So there's basically two challenges in terms of constraints and opportunities we have to look into. The first one is, why do they not adopt irrigation? So why do they continue rainfed farming? Then, okay, they're in the tryout phase. They are doing it right now, but why might they stop? And those are some of the reasons why they might stop. And one is, plant diseases, insect damage, and insufficient water. So, large-scale irrigation has challenges, but generally it has water, even when we have a drought, because you have a big reservoir behind it, or a big offtake. Now, at a smaller scale irrigation, you have a drought, 1 or 2 years, you might not have the water. And so those are some challenges. How can we ensure continuous supply or provide information that maybe next season, you should do millet and not, at least not at a larger scale, something irrigated. It really depends on the technology. So how can we make sure that those constraints are removed once we are actually in a tryout phase to ensure continued adoption? And that's, same in all 3 countries. So Tanzania, also insect damage was number 1. Insufficient water was a concern. And of course, it's also, new irrigators. So they think you need to put a lot of water on all the time. Plant disease, and we have animal damage too. So that is, for economists, interesting. And similarly in Ethiopia, the question was asked slightly differently. Access to markets matters, access to obviously the water body, and distance to the homestead. Again, there's a time use element that's very important here. Good. Those were just some insights, and we hope to do a more complete, panel round of the full set of constraints that affect continued adoption. And I'll hand over to Elizabeth Bryan, who will give you more insights and results from the gender women's empowerment linkages. The irrigation women's empowerment linkages. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claudia, and good morning, everyone. As Claudia mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about the gender insights from different strands of research that we've done under ILSSI. So this includes the action research in the field that Nicole was talking about earlier, as well as the household survey research that we did, and also some qualitative work that we've done around gender in all of the case study countries. So I just want to talk a little bit about why gender matters when we talk about agricultural water management. There's a long literature that shows that women play different roles in agricultural households. And for this reason, they also have different needs and priorities for how they use and manage water. I think we all are very well aware that women have a double burden for both collection and use of domestic water and also involvement in productive uses of water. So as many people have said already this morning, they may prefer more multiple uses of water or to use water in different ways that allow for both of these uses to save their own time and labor. We also know that women face a lot of additional constraints to adopting, to benefiting from, and from continued use of irrigation. And some of these constraints include lack of access to water, also lack of access to land for irrigation, lack of access to credit compared to men, lack of access to information about what technologies are available and how they might use those technologies. So we have to think about ways to overcome some of these constraints if we want to really scale up irrigation technologies to both men and women. And so it's important for irrigation interventions to think about gender because not only is it important for equity, we want to make sure that our programs that we're developing are benefiting both men and women. But as Claudia showed in her first slide, women's empowerment is one of the key pathways through which we can have these big impacts on nutrition and health outcomes, in addition to closing the gender gap and increasing productivity and having women contribute more to increasing household incomes. So these are all important pathways, and women feature very prominently in that. And I'm going to go back to the slide that Nicole presented earlier this morning. The field research shows that there are lots of different benefits from irrigation. And as I mentioned, because women play a different role in the household, they may prioritize some of these benefits over others. And both men and women farmers participated in these interventions, and the technologies that they use are cost-effective for both men and women. But because women are often engaged in producing different kinds of crops, producing crops that may be located closer to the home, and also needing to spend a good deal amount of time to collect domestic water, they may prioritize technologies that not only save labor, but are providing multiple uses. They can be installed close to the home so that they can benefit in multiple ways. And so that may lead to their selection of different technologies that maybe prioritize other of these benefits over things like profit only. And the challenge is developing programs that take into account what men's and women's different preferences are, what their priorities are, and that really consider what men's and women's roles are in different contexts. And this is going to vary, and we've seen this across the 3 case study countries. So programs really need to think about these things and then provide a menu of options that are going to be preferred by both men and women. And also different kinds of men and women. So there are female-headed households and there are married women, and they may have different priorities and preferences for technologies as well, given their situation. Okay. And so one of the other things that Nicole mentioned was the importance of irrigation scheduling tools as a labor-saving technology. And this is also true for women, and both men and women in the field sites recognized the importance of these scheduling tools for saving labor so that they're not over-applying water to their plots. But again, women face a number of constraints in adopting these tools, and this includes lack of access to information about the tools and how to use them, and other kinds of constraints like lack of access to credit to adopt these tools. And we've heard a lot this morning also about value chains and irrigated value chains. And these also offer opportunities for women. So, for example, we've heard through the research in this project and in others, there's a lot of potential for irrigated fodder value chains. And this can be particularly beneficial for women when they're involved in fodder production or when they're involved in other stages of the value chain like milk production and processing. And women are also often selecting crops like these leafy green vegetables, which are highly profitable and are important value chains and sources of income for women. And so we have to be able to promote these crops, but also aware that there is a risk that when some of these activities that are done by women become increasingly profitable, they may be taken over by men in the household. And so that's something that projects need to keep an eye on and track throughout the course of a project to ensure that women are continuing to benefit from the value chains that they're involved in. And as we heard, credit is important for encouraging adoption of small-scale irrigation, and there are some constraints with that. And women tend to face even additional constraints in terms of having access to credit and also just in terms of having a financial training and literacy as compared to men. And we also heard from Nicole's presentation that often households where there are men and women, but there's a high concentration of female labor, they may not be interested to invest in labor-saving technologies because they can rely on the women to provide the free irrigation labor. So there's some opportunities to try and organize women into these small groups so that they can access credit. And maybe through some more informal savings and loan type of arrangements, they can also get more involved in purchasing and using small-scale irrigation. And this can be done with groups of women-only farmers or in mixed groups, depending on the local context and what's appropriate socially there. And now I'm going to move in to talk a little bit more about the household survey results. So the household survey was done covering the areas where the ILSSI interventions were ongoing, and these were led by Amy and Ilri. And then we also expanded our sampling frame to include areas where similar types of production was going on, but we considered these more of a control site. And across all of the different sites that we sampled, we oversampled irrigators, so people who were already irrigating. And so our results that we have from the baseline round of surveys, which is what I'll present, compares sort of irrigators and non-irrigators using traditional methods in these 3 case study countries. And one of the things that we did to really examine more the linkages between women's empowerment and irrigation and also nutritional aspects was to include a module in the survey, which is the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index. And I'm sure those of you who work at USAID are very familiar with this index already, but I'll just summarize it quickly. It's an intra-household survey tool that measures women's empowerment across a range of 5 different domains, and the domains are listed here: production, decision-making, access to productive resources, control over and the use of income, community leadership, and time allocation. And we actually modified this module to include particular questions about irrigation. So, for example, women's decision-making in irrigation, and some of the coding as well to pick up some specific irrigated-related questions. And what we found is that irrigation is not always associated with higher levels of women's empowerment. So in the baseline survey across the 3 countries, we find that women from irrigating households in Ghana and Tanzania actually have higher empowerment scores, but that's not the case for women from irrigating households in Ethiopia. And so again, the intervention matters, and the way that irrigation is carried out and done, and the different roles that men and women play in irrigating are important. And we also found that the contributors to women's disempowerment in each of these 3 countries was different. So things like speaking in public and community leadership are more of an issue in Ethiopia, whereas in Ghana and Tanzania, things like women's lack of access to credit are more important contributors. And now I'm going to dig down into some of the irrigation-specific questions that we added to the WEA, just to give a little bit more insight. In Ethiopia, we found that across the whole module on decision-making, both men and women tend to report high levels of joint decision-making, and that was true also for irrigation. But when we ask women specifically, and men, what's the level of input that you have into specific different decisions that are taken in production and in the household, we find that women feel that they have a little bit less information, that they have only, in this case, input into some of the decisions about how irrigation is used and what is done with the income from the sale of irrigated crops. And that's for both food and cash crops. When we go to the case of Ghana, we see that women feel that they have even more input into decisions about irrigation. So a plurality in most cases of women reported having input into most or some decisions in Ghana. And in Tanzania, the numbers are even higher, where a plurality of women reported that they have input into all decisions related to irrigation and the sale of irrigated crops. And again, we asked specific questions about information. We had a long module that we included in the WEA about access to information from different sources and about different types of information. And we specifically asked men and women if they had access to information about irrigation. And what we find is that across all 3 countries, men tend to report having higher levels of access to information. And interestingly, also, we see low levels of information access among both men and women in Ghana and women in Tanzania. In Ethiopia, where they report having higher amounts of access to information, we still see a large gender gap between men and women in terms of their access. And I also want to talk a little bit about ownership of irrigation technologies. This is a specific question that we added as well. What we find is that in Ghana and Tanzania, both men and women tend to report that men own the physical irrigation equipment. But what's interesting is that women tend to report, in some cases, that they themselves own the technology. But we don't see that among the men's responses. They don't seem to be acknowledging that women feel ownership for this technology. Both men and women do report some joint ownership of the technology in Ghana and Tanzania. But in Ethiopia, interestingly, across both men and women, almost everyone reported joint ownership of technology. But I want to dig down into this issue of ownership a little bit more, because what does that actually mean? We did some qualitative research in all 3 countries that really tried to look at women's preferences for technology, their control over the technologies, different ways that men and women use the technologies. And what we find is that just reaching women with the technology is not enough, because there are different rights to the technology when you dig down into it. Men and women may have different rights to use a technology. They may have different rights to benefit from the technology and to control income from, the benefits of that technology, or to give it away or to rent it out. And so it's important to think about all of these different types of, or, values of ownership. And so what we did was we tried to dig down into this and come up with some recommendations based on the findings from this qualitative research about how to increase women's awareness of technologies, to encourage women to try out these technologies, and then also to try and ensure that women are able to sustain use and to reap the benefits from these technologies over time. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about these recommendations across these 3 different aspects of adoption, which is awareness, tryout, and continued adoption. In terms of awareness, one of the things that we found is that women do have different sources of information that they rely on, and that we cannot assume that just because a man is reached for information, for example, if you call a man to invite him to attend a training or some kind of informational meeting, that their wife is going to get that information. And I think the field research showed that women actually tend to have much less access to cell phones, for example. So it's important to think about, when you're trying to reach both men and women, what are the channels of information that men and women use, and how can you reach both men and women with that information? Other barriers to women's participation in program activities can be overcome by, for example, inviting both men and women together to attend a training, or in cases where women need permission to travel to go to a training, then they should be able to get that from their husbands, or to try and allow women to bring children with them, or to provide childcare so that they're able to take time out of their busy schedule and participate in activities. So there are lots of approaches that need to be developed based on the local context and what's appropriate for women's behavior in that context, so that they can participate and benefit from these informational trainings. And in order to really get women to try out the technology, a number of the constraints that I mentioned earlier need to be overcome. And so this includes things like making credit access available to men and women, and maybe women can get easier access to credit through small groups, for example. We also have to think about the different types of constraints that different types of women may face. So female heads of household may be more labor constrained, which could be a huge barrier for them to adopt technology. So are there other types of labor sharing arrangements, for example, that women can rely on to then apply irrigation water once they've adopted a technology? In households where there's a high level of female labor but a male head, who may not think it's necessary to adopt technology, maybe there are ways of working within the household and within the community for men and women to really understand and appreciate the labor burden that women face, and to try and help them overcome some of these barriers and get access to the technology. And another thing that can be done is to think about ways in a local context that support women having access to land and water for irrigation, because this can be a constraint in some contexts. And again, I just want to reiterate that targeting women with technology doesn't mean that they're going to be able to control that technology. We have to think about ways to get women not only using the technology, but also benefiting from the sale of the crops that they're growing with that technology. And we have to try and then safeguard the profits or the benefits that women may get from the use of the technology through our interventions to ensure that men are not taking over activities that women are benefiting from as they become more profitable. And we also want to encourage a reduction in women's time burden through the use of these technologies so that they can invest more in childcare and other activities, income-earning activities that they may be interested in, and so that we can really maximize not only the income and production benefits of irrigation, but also thinking a step further about what are the nutrition and health implications of the interventions that we're introducing. And so I'll stop there, and I think we'll take some questions now in the panel.
Why don't you stay there?
Thank you. I'll stay up here? Okay.
If I could ask Nicole and Claudia to come and join up here, and then we'll open the session for questions. All right, yes. Let's see.
Thank you. Let me. I need to introduce myself. No?
Yes.
Introduce myself. My name is Raymond January Kayumbe. I'm from Tanzania. Thank you very much, all presenters, for the excellent presentation. Now, I have a small question, I think, of course, it started, I think, from Claudia, and it was also mentioned by the last speaker. It's about technology and the technology related to irrigation scheduling. I find it to be very, very important, especially when we are fighting against the climate change, shortage of water. This could be a very, very relevant and important tool to have. But now, my question is, what is your comment on the availability to start with of the tool, appropriateness, adaptability, and the last one on the if there could be the after-sales services in our countries, because there are new things and new items, and probably if we want to promote to them beyond the project, where do we get them?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you want to do it one by one?
Just you choose.
Okay. No, I think that's probably the critical question, right? So what we did was we looked at low-cost tensometers. We looked at a wetting front detector, in some countries combined with a chameleon sensors, and then also just actually using a crop water requirement and comparing those three against then fourth being farmer practice. So yes, of course, you see an improvement, and actually the improvement of the tensometer was better than crop water requirement, and then the wetting front detector was better than that. In the case of the wetting front detector, it's a fairly intuitive. It's not a complicated tool to understand in terms of how it shows farmers when to stop irrigating and when to irrigate again. But they are not available in the country. So that is a huge issue. The supply chain issue is the critical question if you're going to talk about scaling up. So we deliberately chose tools and methods that were not high cost, but being very much aware that we were bringing these in as something relatively new to those countries. They're not necessarily new technologies, but new to those countries or those contexts. Aware that if it works, then you have to then begin to look at what are the supply chain issues, what are the cost issues to import, what are the cost implications, and if it's even possible to manufacture them locally. Could they be adapted and produced locally in a cheaper way? So that is a supply chain question that is, it's fundamental to scaling and making this work. So at present, no, they are not available in those countries. They could be, and we can look at options of adapting them and even making them more affordable. Also, cost sharing, whether, there's a whole lot of models that could be looked at for scaling those up. Yep, sorry.
All right, first off, I just want to say congratulations. This is fantastic studies and data here. Very, very impressive to see. I'm Martin Fisher from Kickstart, and we've been promoting hundreds of thousands of irrigation pumps across sub-Saharan Africa. And it really supports a lot of what we've already seen in our studies, but great to see it in a lot more detail, and the level of the integrity of the data is fantastic. Just a couple of questions. When you, obviously, labor saving, you say is most important. In your control group, and maybe I missed this at the beginning, was the control group irrigating or with buckets, or were they not irrigating at all? So just
Do you want to go ahead?
It's probably different if you talk about the field research versus the household survey. We had control sites, but we also sampled irrigators in the control sites. So we have sort of an overrepresentation of households that were using irrigation. But this is drawing on our baseline survey results, which include sort of existing irrigation before the interventions have been rolled out. We expect to be able to look at how things have changed, and in particular, for my interest, looking at changes in women's empowerment as a result of using more improved irrigated technologies, and how that might change the dynamics and also the nutritional outcomes. But I think in the field research, they did have some controls, and we're looking sort of over time in action research, tracking differences between the people using the old methods and the new.
Yeah. That's correct. So our control group in this particular case, we're using buckets and watering cans.
They were using buckets, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they were irrigating, but with buckets, great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not a comparison of rain-fed or non-irrigation.
Okay.
It's comparing different methods.
Fantastic. So it's a high return on labor for different. That's fantastic. Yeah, that was one of my second questions. Is you talk a lot about women's empowerment. You talk about the changes or differences between countries, but I was wondering if you're also looking at the differences between the type of technology used and whether you saw different levels around women's empowerment there. And just one final question I'll put out too, which is around the fodder. And I think this is really interesting. We've certainly seen it. A lot of farmers growing fodder. But one question I always have around fodder is for transport of fodder and storage of fodder. Does it also require to be baled, or are you seeing it being sold very locally without baling? And how do they transport that fodder? So,
Do you want to take the first
Yeah.
one?
So, as I mentioned, we basically in the household survey data, we lump all irrigators together. So these could be people using irrigation. So we're basically comparing rain-fed versus irrigated outcomes in terms of women's empowerment. After we're about to finish the second round in our last country, which is Ghana, like probably in about a week. So we'll have a second round of data from all three countries very soon. And so we'll be potentially able to break it down and look at different types of irrigation technologies. But I think because there were so many different technologies being piloted, I'm not sure that we'll be able to get statistically significant results for individual technologies, but rather maybe looking at differences between traditional versus improved or something along those lines. That could be possible.
Another question, please?
Sorry, I'll answer on the fodder, and I'll do it very crudely, and then ask that you speak with our colleague from ILRI, Ben, and I'll introduce you at the break at lunchtime. But just very basically speaking, there was a number of different types of fodder and foragers that were looked at. To my understanding, they're not baling. Some of them obviously are bundling to get them to market, but not necessarily baling. And some of them may lend themselves to that, and some may not. But Ben from ILRI really has led those studies across the different countries, and he can really answer. He can answer properly.
Just one more question. When are you going to publish?
Go ahead, Claudia.
I mean, we have a revise and resubmit. I mean, there are various stages, and we have a bunch of policy notes out. In fact, the one on gender that Elizabeth presented at the end is outside at the front table. So it came, I guess, after your registration, but it's there now. And so and then we have a discussion paper on the gender Yeah, we have actually at least 2 revised. Okay, we have a bunch of papers. They will come out this year, subject to review processes. But yes, very quickly now. I think we are really rolling it out.
We
And
have,
the same on the field studies.
You have you received a flash stick when you
As well.
checked in a while ago.
Right.
If you go to that flash stick, you'll see all the publications and all the reports that are available today, and that's in the hundreds. So there's quite a bit of information available. You'll also, if you look at that flash drive, you'll see a video of the story that you heard here actually being recited by African farmers as they're using the technology, and then that gives you also directions to our website, so we can inundate you with whatever you would like to hear about that. Another question?
Good. Brian Bruns, interesting stuff on the financing. Wanted to ask, to what extent has it seemed feasible to use the irrigation equipment itself as collateral, either explicitly or implicitly in kind of rent-to-buy, hire purchase things, and to the extent, if there are insights in terms of any of what was being raised, the gender dimensions of who owns or controls the technology and control over benefits. Thank you.
I'll take the finance one, you can get the... Okay. With the finance, we didn't look specifically at, because we're not lenders ourselves, we had to work with whoever was available in terms of cooperatives and locally. And in this particular study, the only country where there were local cooperatives that we could engage with was Ethiopia. So I want to make that fairly clear. In the other countries, there just were very few cooperatives and rural banks that were lending to farmers, local enough that the farmers could actually do that and for us to work with them. In these particular cases, we did not come across any lending institutions that were willing to use the technology itself as the collateral. There's business models for that. Other projects and things are looking at business models and opportunities for financing, pay-as-you-go. There's a range of opportunities available, but in this particular project, we didn't come across any institutions that were willing to consider that collateral itself. In Ethiopia, most of the time, the collateral was livestock. And it's one of the disincentives for borrowing is that livestock is seen as critical to livelihoods. It also has, other, social, cultural, there's a whole range of things that people associate with livestock in terms of their own livelihoods and the family unit and the community. And so that, what is being proposed as collateral and how that loan is being collected by the lending institution and the institutions that they lean on to help them collect can be disincentives for farmers to borrow. So there's a whole issue around terms and conditions of repayment and collateral that are going to be really important to making microfinance really a feasible option for scaling.
Yeah, and maybe Nicole can add a little bit to this as well, but my understanding is that it depends, in terms of the gender implications, it depends on the technology. In Ghana in particular, when motor pumps were even adopted by women, they were still considered to be owned by men. So there, if it depends on the technology and how it's used, if it's something that's installed and applied close to the home, then women may have easier access and sort of control over that technology. But if it's a motor pump that's being moved to a field, even if women are the ones to technically receive the technology, if you're reaching women with it, it's still considered to be owned by men in some cases.
Yeah, and so I think both for Tanzania and Ghana, when we asked this question about ownership, one of the responses that we would get in the focus groups that we did, because that research was done qualitatively, was that it's considered a major asset, and so it sort of follows the practices around ownership of livestock. So, in the context where women were necessarily allowed to be considered the actual owner of large livestock, that sort of, for some reason, that practice sort of was translated into the ownership of other major assets, such as pumps. So what we actually saw was cases where a project would actually directly give a pump to a woman in a household, and then you could go back 2 or 3 months later and ask, is there any women in the household that own a pump? And they would say no. So you directly targeted them with it, but when you went back and asked, they said, no, I don't own it. I can't own it. So there's a lot of issues around ownership once it reaches the household. And so that's one of the reasons why our qualitative research really focused on what happens to that technology once it reaches the household.
Question right back there.
It's like being interrogated. The lights are so bright.
Yeah, I have a question related to the finance too, as well as, has there been any leasing options, specifically on things like drip irrigation kits and things like that? Pumps are a little bit different, and you could see where you could get a lot more use out of them, and they're actually easier to pay off and because you don't need one every day. But you don't use drip irrigation kits year-round either. So there may be greater use if they're lent out rather than owned outright. Plus, they need to be replaced often.
Right. So I think it's important also to recognize that the supply chains for irrigation technologies are just not developed. And oftentimes you'll find what you call like a system integrator. So the person that imports, supplies, services, it's the same company. And in terms of actually finding that system integrator or that pump importer or supplier, they themselves rarely lease. What you do find is a service provider model where you will get a farmer or a young person who purchases a pump and then rents it out to fellow farmers. And they might use it on their own farm and rent to other farmers for a fee, or they might just be putting it on a back of a bicycle and going around with it. I think it's also, just to keep in mind that while you may not use it necessarily year-round or all the time, the farmers are all needing it around the same time. So there is limits to that because, if you have several different farmers who are renting that from you, you have to be able to schedule, the farmer's time around that because they all want it in the dry season at the same peak times with the crop cycle. So again, there are business models for looking at leasing, but that requires an intervention along the supply chain to reduce risks for those private sector actors who are trying to develop that supply chain. So there's different modalities for that, but we're not really seeing it at this point because the supply chains are just really, really undeveloped. So one of the things that we, I think, there's a number of organizations and ourselves and this project included looking at some of those different business modalities, those business model opportunities for leasing, pay-as-you-go, rental systems, and that kind of thing. So it's definitely an option, but it's not in practice right now.
My question is for Claudia and the nutrition studies. Sorry, Daniel Bailey with USAID. I think there's been a lot of research in the last decade or two on the income pathway to dietary diversity and nutrition outcomes. But it was my impression that the majority of them came away with saying that there was no correlation between better dietary diversity and nutrition impacts from higher income. So did you study these programs to determine what else the programs did in order to cause a positive correlation in that?
In fact, so what I did show was exactly that the income pathway leads to intermediate nutrition outcomes. So we did collect all the anthropometrics. So you're talking about wasting and stunting. And so this is, again, the baseline, so where we have various values. And what we're really interested in, obviously, is the first 1,000 days for the final nutritional indicators or the end indicators. And so basically, we're not there yet to tell you that we will have positively affected childhood undernutrition, like stunting, or wasting through irrigation. So we can show that yes, we have the strong evidence on the intermediate nutritional indicators. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it's a multi-pronged challenge. So irrigation likely is not going to be if you only do irrigation and nothing else, you probably will not get the bang for the buck. I think there's slowly increasing confidence that if you combine it with, for example, nutritional behavioral change communication, that you can actually, go over to the other side, that we will have strong, better growth on that end. And to be said is that these irrigation developments that are out there, even the farmer-led irrigation is not developed to improve nutrition, right? It's developed to improve incomes, yields, and so we'll see what we'll find after we finished analysis of the 2 rounds of the data. The other, opportunity and challenge that we've had is that our interventions were not. It's not an RCT, so that's what we actually really need to do. Complete controlled research design to get at some of those, to get at a strong, to see if we can get a strong stunting signal. And the study was really designed to work with farmers in the field, and so this study will not be the one that will get you the conclusive result in that area. We have been trying to do a study that would do that, like a large RCT, but it's challenging to actually get that off the ground because there's weather matters. Irrigation technology, you've heard a lot about that. It's very site-specific, can be expensive. How do you get it to the farmers? And also that the nutrition community hasn't actually necessarily been sold on irrigation as a nutrition-sensitive intervention. I think we have to do a lot of work there. As I mentioned, that last point, bring these sectors together to talk to each other. For them, especially from the large-scale irrigation side, irrigation might be a detractor. It might negatively affect nutrition, right? We are taking the water away from drinking, wash, we are polluting it, so why do we want to talk with you? So there are these big barriers that we are trying to overcome, and I think this study is really a step along the way, but unfortunately it will not be the definitive study yet. So I hope we will be able to work on the definitive one in the future.
Just a small addition to that, we heard at the World Bank conference for the last day and a half that if you're talking about looking at the impact of irrigation, you have to think about irrigation in the context of a total production system that optimizes the use of the water. So that's one of the things that causes the total outcome to improve. Next question.
I can just add to that one thing. We're in the middle of a large RCT with UCSF Medical School, looking at the impact.
Yeah.
Hold on.
Just saying, we're in the middle of a large RCT with UCSF Medical School, looking at the impacts of irrigation on families with HIV-positive members, which will be looking at a lot of the whole family health in a lot of detail with a lot of medical data out of it.
Okay.
That'll be another couple of years, but.
And IFPRI colleagues, I have to say, they did do a kitchen garden study that focused not on irrigation, but irrigation was provided. They did find definitive stunting benefits or nutritional benefits. So there are some studies, but they were not designed. And some studies are ongoing. We are actually trying to be aware of most of them or all of them. So there are definitive studies on the kitchen garden side. And obviously, irrigation is quite helpful if you want to maintain your kitchen garden in the dry season. So, it depends how you skin and scale and cut the intervention. But yes, so I think we will get there. We will get to a positive, and we just need more studies. Yeah, thanks.
Other questions, please. I see any more hands anywhere? Here, there's one.
This isn't so much a question because I was involved.
Would you identify yourself,
I'm sorry,
please?
I'm Ruth Meinzendick. So it's not so much of a question because I was involved in the study, but something I have been musing over in the last 2 days and the discussion today of what's really new in this, with the emphasis on irrigation as part of value chains. I think it's important to realize that we're starting to go quite a ways toward addressing gender in the acquisition of the technology. We're not there totally yet. But unless gender is also addressed in the value chain of the marketing of the produce, you're taking away all of that gain. And I was really struck by the qualitative data of women saying, now the grain goes to the warehouse, and I don't know how much there is. And I can't even ask my husband without fear of him being angry at me. So everybody says, oh, warehousing programs, that's really wonderful, right? Because then they can get higher income. But if in the process the women have lost control over that, and they don't know what he is spending that money on, then we're losing a lot in this. And so I just want to underscore that if you're going to talk about value chains as being this wonderful thing, and with the new technologies, there is no excuse for not providing the information and the payment to women. Don't take it away, is my plea.
Mike, are you coming in? Identify yourself, please.
Mike Dockery. I'm coming from the experience as the implementer of some of these projects, most recently the COP of the ATT project in Tamale. A couple questions and comments. What do women spend their money on when they earn additional income? Our experience is in order of priority medical services, particularly for diarrheal and malaria treatments. Second, education fees, especially for girls, so girls stay in school longer. And then third, they collaborate and partner with other women on small business startup. So you're hitting a lot of DOs there with additional income. Collaboration between ministries, health and ag. Given the disproportionate expenditures by host governments and donors over the last 20 years to health programs, that negotiation is incredibly difficult, both at the national level and particularly at the local level, at the province or state or district level, between Ministry of Health and Ministry of Agriculture. And you can see that. It's very evident when you go to places like Bogatonga or Wow or Tamale and just look at the ministries. And so integrating those programs is incredibly difficult. And finally, very interesting that you two recognize, because we're doing, ATT was doing collaborative research with IFRI up there in Sashi, and we were making sure our protocols were identical so that you could use our data too. And we were working with UDS and IWMI. But the pest issue, you're creating this microenvironment in which pests would normally be dormant in the dry season, and suddenly it's a feast. And I was wondering if you were looking beyond that to the next rain-fed cropping season to see if there was additional expenditures needed for pest control. Thanks.
Great statements, and I think I'll agree with all of them. Yeah, you're right. We should look at the office space that each district department has in terms of the relative power they have, or how many computers. So that's a good way. And then you have to start with the one with most and bring the other ones in. But yeah, so that is a good question. We can look at that question. If the pest management, expenditures, or anyway, if there is a difference the following season. So that will be very interesting. We can look at that. We certainly have the data. We have not thought about that, which again, as I said, we're the economists, so the pest and disease thing, we have to actually talk to pest and disease experts, and we have them in the project, but it's so important to be interdisciplinary. Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks.
We are
Sorry, I just want to add to that. you were mentioning the difficulties with cross-sector collaboration. I would also say there's difficulties in integrating gender into a lot of these programs. So one of the things that we actually did through ILSSI is to have gender and irrigation training workshops in all 3 countries. And actually, I was surprised that a lot of people turned out. It wasn't all just women, and we had a mix of people from sort of the irrigation programming side, from the nutrition and health side, and a lot of gender experts as well in the country. So I think, you know, people may not have been as aware of what can be done to integrate gender, but there was a lot of interest there and a lot of cross-fertilization of ideas amongst different kinds of policymakers and different kinds of stakeholders. So I think things are moving in the right direction towards hopefully more cross-sector and greater gender integration.
I just wanted to mention that if we're involved in a further carry-on of our studies now, we've already been encouraged by our AID representative, our activity manager, to look into partnering with a pest management innovation laboratory, because we really do realize that the introduction of a threshold of pest activity, not the dry season, but something that feeds the next rainy season, is something that we're going to have to deal with. I believe that's a fairly broad question that you've identified, Mike.
Thanks. Did you look at all at the impact on the rain-fed crop? Because we've seen sort of 2 extremes to that. One is that people have more money, and especially more money when it's time to buy seeds and fertilizer for their rain-fed crop, so huge increases in rain-fed yields. And on the other extreme, we've seen that people are making so much money from irrigation that they give up on rain-fed altogether because they don't need it anymore, and they just time their irrigation to make the money. But I don't know if you've looked at that yet.
It wasn't necessarily an explicit question within this research project, but it's definitely something that when you go through the surveys, the qualitative research, it's clear that people will say, you know, I'm using some of the money from the irrigated agriculture to be able to buy inputs for rain-fed. However, one of the things that I would say is that it's also context dependent around land issues. For example, in Ghana, where the occupant or the farmer of the land switches between seasons, it may not apply, right? So you oftentimes have your dry season farmers on plots, and then they have to move off during the rainy season for the mainland lowered. Well, he may be using some of the rent money for those inputs, but I think that there's definitely a question in there about the shifting land tenure between seasons and how much you can have a sort of continuation across seasons as opposed to having that kind of interrupted. But it's clear that this is something that people are thinking about, is how do I use the money from either season as an input into the next one.
We have a rich experience in the developed world about irrigation becoming very popular and over-irrigating and either damaging water supplies or depleting water supplies, and I think we're going to be needing to address the overall issue of optimum kinds of levels of irrigation. And I think you'll hear in our study in our report this afternoon that there are some emerging models that allow one to look at where the water is and how much there is and how it can be sustainably used, and that's going to be another important overall strategic conclusion from this kind of study. Well, I've been hanging out with ag people for quite a while, and I've learned only 1 or 2 or 3 really fundamental important things. One of them is that if you're standing between agriculturalists and a food supply, you're likely to be run over. So, and I see the food supply is back there, and there are several people imperiled. So I would like to invite you to think about having some lunch and continuing your discussion over lunch, and then you go to the back. You'll see the buffet set there. And the intent is to bring it back here to your tables and eat your lunch, and then we'll pick up afterwards. Thanks for your active participation in these questions, and thank you guys for your presentations this morning. Here we go.